This is The Bad News, where we ask difficult theological questions. In this episode, the question is it possible to be an atheist Christian? In order to understand that question, we first have to understand what it means to be an atheist and what it means to be a Christian. Now, the definition of atheist is anyone who does not believe in a divine God or anything supernatural. The opposite of that is a theist, someone who does believe in the supernatural, which includes believing in God or gods, plural. So to be a theist doesn't mean you're a Christian, because even other religions believe in different gods, which means they too are not atheist. Now, the definition of Christian is not the same definition of theist, as I just explained. The definition of Christian is anyone who follows Christ, and that's it. Now, in the first century, during the time of Jesus, a follower of Christ actually followed him physically. The original followers of Christ physically followed him and physically did what Jesus was doing. However, in the 21st century, that doesn't seem to be possible for us. Or is it? Now, for example, if you followed me and did what I told you to do, then you are my follower. But that doesn't mean that you think I'm God, nor do you have to believe that I'm God for you to follow me. The bad news is that the definition of Christian does not inherently require that the followers of Christ believe he is God. All it requires is for that person to follow Christ. In today's day and age, the definition of Christian does not change just because Jesus isn't physically with us. We still have to physically do what Jesus commands us to do. Luckily for us, Jesus tells us exactly what he wants us to do. Like Moses, who gave Israel commands to follow and obey, Jesus also gives us commands to follow and obey. The bad news is following and obeying these instructions and commands given to us by Jesus Christ himself determines whether or not we follow Christ. Simply believing that Jesus is real or that he is the Son of God is not the definition of a Christian. We know this to be true because the religious Pharisees and the patriotic Romans who crucified Jesus also believed that Jesus was real. Or do you think they crucified their imaginary friend? Of course not. In fact, Satan, if you believe in him, also believes Jesus is real. How many times in the Bible does Jesus run into demons who declare that he is the Son of God? Yet you don't consider these demons to be Christians. Or do you? Because simply believing Jesus is real or that he is the Son of God does not mean that you follow him. The bad news is following Jesus requires more than just mental belief. It requires you to physically act and behave in such a way that embraces the commands of Jesus. So, what are his commands? In Matthew 7, verse 12, Jesus said, "Treat one another in the same way that you would like to be treated." This is the essence of everything God wants you to do. Now, this is known as the Golden Rule. Nothing about this command requires faith in God. It's a good rule to live by, whether or not you believe Jesus is real. The bad news is you can do God's will by simply treating others well, regardless what religion you believe in or lack of religion. Don't believe me? Well, that's exactly what Jesus is saying in this following parable, found in Matthew 21, verses 28 through 32. Goes like this. A father commands his son, "Go out and work in the vineyard today." The son replied, "No, I won't." But he went out and worked anyways. Then The father commanded his other son the same thing. Go out and work in the vineyard today. The son replied, Yes, sir. But he did not go out and work. So Jesus then asks the religious people whom he was telling this parable to, which of the two sons followed and obeyed the commands of the father? And they replied, The first one, the one that denied the father with his words, but was faithful with his actions. And Jesus tells them that they are correct. Understand that these are the words of Jesus. This is actually found in the Bible, but you won't see preachers teaching on this because this goes against popular theology. What Jesus is saying is he would rather you reject him with your words, but follow him with your actions by obeying his commands, like the first son. Because unlike the second son, simply saying yes to the Father is not enough. Simply saying you follow Christ means absolutely nothing. You actually have to obey Christ through your actions. Let's move on. Another command of Jesus is found in Matthew 22, verses 37 through 39. Jesus said, This is the greatest command. Love God. And equally as great is love one another. The key word here is equally. Jesus is equating the love of neighbor to the love of God. We should think of this as a math equation. If A equals B, then B equals A. So if you love one another, then you automatically love God. However, the opposite is also true. If you do not love one another, then you do not love God. It's that simple. Again, those are the commands and instructions of Jesus himself. The bad news is if you claim to be a Christian and you claim to love God, but you hate others, then according to Jesus, you don't actually love God and you are not actually following Jesus and his commands. Therefore, you aren't a Christian. No matter what you say, no matter what you claim to believe, you cannot follow Christ if you don't do what he says for you to do. It's not that hard to understand. It makes total sense. Let's move on. John 13, 34, 35. Jesus said, I am giving you a new command, one that Moses did not give you, and that is to love one another. And if you do that, you will prove to the world that you are following me. It does not get any more direct or any more clear than that. Jesus himself defines Christians as anyone who loves others. Who best to define what Christianity means than Christ himself? In order to prove that you follow Christ, you have to love one another. And not just your friends and your family, or those that look like you, or speak like you, or believe the same religion you believe in. Everyone. Jesus even goes on to say to love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Not once does he command that we believe that he is real, or that we love those who love him and hate those who hate him. He only ever said that those who love one another prove that they follow him. The opposite is also true. Those who do not love one another prove that they do not follow Christ, regardless of what they say they believe, because their actions and their character reflects their true faith. Now, what does Jesus mean by love? A wonderful parable in which Jesus explains what love means to him is found in Matthew 25. It starts in verse 31. Jesus defines two types of people in this parable, good and bad. They are known as the sheep, who are the good ones, and the bad ones are known as the goats. There are no in-between here. You cannot be somewhat good or somewhat bad. You are either good or you are bad. You are either following Christ or you are not. Jesus begins the parable by defining who the good people are. According to Jesus, the good ones are those who fed him when he was hungry, who gave him a drink when he was thirsty, who welcomed him into their home when he was a foreigner and an immigrant. those who gave him clothing when he was naked, those who cared for him when he was sick, and those who sought justice for him when he was oppressed or in prison. The most interesting part of this entire parable is that the good sheep, the good people, are confused the entire time. In verse 37, they say, "When did we ever do any of those things for you, Jesus?" The good sheep are not living a life focused on Jesus. They don't claim to follow him, and they don't recall ever helping him. They could very well be atheists. Or if they're not atheists, they're not followers of Christ, that's for sure. At least they don't say that they are. They don't claim to be. And Jesus tells them, it doesn't matter whether or not you claim to follow Jesus. It doesn't matter that you're atheist, because what actually matters is that you helped those in need. Every time the good sheep helped someone in need, Jesus tells them that they were actually helping him. These people that Jesus defines as good only helped people for the sake of helping them. Not because they loved Jesus, but because they loved their neighbor, and so they took care of them. And Jesus declares them as good, and he welcomes them into his kingdom. Now, let's move on further down the parable, where Jesus begins to define those who are bad. The bad goats are those who did not take care of him when he was suffering, when he was hungry, thirsty, sick, naked, or a foreigner. And in verse 44, the goats say to Jesus, "When did we ever see you suffering?" And what we can understand from that is if they did see Jesus suffering, then they would have helped him. Now that sounds good because those who want to help Jesus are the good ones, right? That's not what Jesus says. He says, "You were only willing to help me if you saw me suffering. However, there are all these brothers and sisters, the least fortunate of your neighbors, suffering right in front of you, and you did not help them. Therefore, you did not help me." Jesus is telling them they missed the point of what it means to follow him, and therefore they are not welcome into his kingdom. Though they wanted to help Jesus, Jesus rejects them, because the point of following Jesus is not to try and help him, but to try and help others. Follow him in helping others, in helping those who are suffering, who are hungry, oppressed, marginalized, who are held captive. Jesus himself defines good people as those who love and take care of others, regardless if they believe in him, regardless of their religion or lack of religion. Good people are good because they do good towards others. Bad people are bad because they refuse to take care of one another. It doesn't matter if you say you're a Christian. It does not matter if you go to church every single Sunday. It doesn't matter if you read the Bible every day, or if you pray the sinner's prayer, or if you don't drink, or if you don't smoke, or if you believe in God. None of those things define who you are. None of those things are evidence of your character. They don't show the fruits of your spirit, and they do not prove that you follow Christ. Because as Jesus himself said, the only thing that proves that you follow me are those who do what I tell them to do, are those who take care of one another. Let's move on. Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, Jesus said, "Just because you call me Lord does not mean you are welcomed into my kingdom. Only those who actually do what I tell them to do will enter." You'll never hear a pastor preaching on that verse. Jesus cannot be any more clear. What Jesus is telling us to do is to take care of one another. Those who do that are Christians, and those who do not are not Christians. It's that simple. Being a Christian has nothing to do with believing in God. Taking care of one another is so fundamental, any atheist can do it. It does not require a religion. Now, I'm not saying that believing in God is bad. What I am saying, though, is that not believing in God is also not bad. In fact, if you only believe in God and you don't love and take care of others, then that is what is bad. If you claim to love Christ, but you continue to judge people because of their skin color or sexual preference or belief in another religion or because of any other aspect that does not define their character, then you are behaving in a way that is anti the commands of Christ. So by definition, you are anti-Christ. Does that make sense? Christians should be embarrassed because they only claim to follow Jesus so that they can leave this earth and everyone's suffering behind just to get into heaven. On the contrary, humanist atheists could not care less about heaven because they're so focused on the well-being of others right now, here on earth, just like Jesus was. Did Jesus not leave heaven to help us on earth? Did Jesus not pray we bring heaven to earth? Did Jesus not command us to take care of one another on earth? To answer the question, is it possible to be an atheist Christian? The bad news is, genuine Christians today are atheists.